it was a joy to see Julian Assange walk out of prison. I suspect he's a great hero of yours.
Well, yes. I mean, I remain somewhat speechless that this has happened at all. It was very abrupt. I gather from sources close to Julian that he has been very optimistic over the past year to an extent that he hasn't been before. So perhaps he knew this was coming. But no, I mean, it's an extraordinary victory for the many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people over the world who've marched, who've harassed their elected representatives, who've tweeted, who've written about him. Yeah, it's really quite extraordinary. And it appears that he's been given a green light to keep on going now. So I'm sure he will.
What to you was among the reactions to his release, what was the most distasteful one? The ones were, I mean, I can't make my mind up between the ones who are saying he's not a real journalist and the ones who are lying about the fact that he endangered his sources, that he has blood on his hands.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a difficult trade-off. I think that we know for a fact, based on US legal submissions in the trial of Chelsea Manning and also Julian's own trial, that nobody was ever harmed by WikiLeaks disclosures. So, I mean, to see people trotting out this perverse libel is pretty repulsive, but it's also to be expected. And I think that it is a means of maintaining this mainstream stigma around Julian without, even while he's at liberty, like, so to speak. I think we've seen a lot of the smears that have been directed at Assange over the past kind of decade and a half spun out, but the overwhelming majority of people aren't listening. You know, nobody takes the mainstream media seriously anymore. Nobody believes that Julian is a Russian agent or a rapist or a threat to national security. They see him as a valiant truth teller who was persecuted and tortured for the crime of publishing secrets the US government didn't want in the public domain.
You come from the cradle of democracy.
Indeed.
And, you know, we here in the Balkans, we have been for decades asking for those standards of journalism and that kind of freedom of the press. So could you start by telling me, how did you get in trouble with your own government practicing journalism?
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, when I flew back to London which was in May 2023, there was a team of armed counter-terror police cheerily waiting for me on the tarmac. I'd been expecting to potentially be stopped at the border ever since I made the fatal error of reporting on Paul Mason's leaked emails. This Paul Mason is a British journalist who has been distinguished himself as a nauseating propagandist for NATO and the proxy war in Ukraine since February 2022, and was targeting a number of people that I knew, including journalists and academics and activists who were opposed to the proxy war. And these leaked emails showed that he was coordinating his activities with a British intelligence officer linked to MI6. So, I mean, the public's interest in reporting on this seemed like pretty clear. I then subsequently received an email from a British detective inviting me cordially to an interview in London.
What did they do? I know that you said they fingerprinted you, took your DNA, but also seized all your electronic equipment, right?
Yeah, and so effectively I was stopped under legislation which is called the 2019 Counter-Terrorism and Border Act, which effectively creates suspicionless crimes. So the wording is Orwellian and disturbingly vague. So it states that you can be suspected of working in the interests of a hostile foreign power without knowing you are, and without the foreign power in whose interest you are operating knowing you are either. It's quite some conspiracy when conspirators don't know that they're conspiring. And so, I was subject to DNA swabs. I was told by a counter-terror officer with a thick Northern Irish accent, which gives you some indication of his professional background and what he was getting up to during the Troubles, quote unquote, that if my DNA wasn't found on an IED in Afghanistan, it would be deleted within 6 months, which wasn't particularly reassuring. And I was forced to hand over the passwords and PIN codes to my SIM cards, to my digital devices, and if I'd refused, I would have been arrested.
So you cooperated?
Yeah, so I decided to cooperate because I felt, well, I have nothing to hide. I had to answer. I was asked extensive questions about my personal and professional background, my personal life, why I write, say and think the things that I do, and then that was more general. There were very, very specific questions about the Greyzone, and it was clear that this was the core thrust of their interest.
And the Grayzone is an independent investigative site in the United States, right? That you work for, that you write for.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I run the UK division, as it were, or the UK desk, although, we operate on a shoestring because we are independent and reject corporate.
So they were more interested in the Grayzone than in anything related to Belgrade.
Yeah, they didn't have any. They wanted to know why I lived in Serbia.
What did you say?
Oh well, I said because I stated that I love the people, I love the culture, and I love the history, and the food's pretty good too.
Did they take that for a reason?
Yeah, they accepted that. Although I think that it was very, very clear that they found everything about me intensely suspicious. So they asked me specifically how and why I got into writing about national security issues, but also why I wrote about the British government. I mean, it seemed quite a strange concept to them that you would criticise your own government, which I think speaks volumes about their perspectives on the world. But yeah, their sole interest was the Greyzone and why I write the particular things that I do for them. They initially stated that they were interested in everywhere that I wrote for. But then they didn't ask one question about the Cradle, where I am a regular contributor. Again, an independent news resource focused on West Asia. They didn't ask about Mint Press News. In fact, they even referred to it at one stage as Mint Press Zone. And then there were a large number of questions about my reporting on a court filing which showed that 2 of the 9/11 hijackers, at least 2 of them, were working for the CIA. They were very interested in that. One of them let slip that one of the officers, I might add that I was not allowed to learn their names. I was given their call signs, so it was like B1 and A2. And at one stage, the female officer seemed to forget what her own call sign was, which was quite farcical. But yeah, there were a lot of questions about Russia and whether I personally knew any Russian intelligence officials and had regular contact with them. To which the answer was, of course, no. And also a completely ludicrous question about whether the Grayzone had a formal agreement with the FSB to publish hacked information, which I kind of splutteringly said no, because it was just such a bizarre line of inquiry. And then I was asked why I responded the way that I did. Why was I so certain? They apparently don't understand how journalism works.
You know how they say, it has a chilling effect on people who practice journalism. That did it?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And it's, I mean, on that subject, the British government has now passed this even more horrifying legislation called the National Security Act, which creates all sorts of new criminal offences. And like the legislation under which I was detained and interrogated, has very vague, kind of almost perplexing language where it states that, well, someone can be convicted of working for a foreign intelligence service without the British state needing to prove what foreign intelligence service they're working for, or that someone can be convicted for receiving a quote-unquote benefit from a intelligence service without that benefit being defined. My overall take is that this is effectively creating a framework whereby literally anyone can be prosecuted for any reason. It's just a matter of who they choose to prosecute. And I imagine that there are mainstream journalists will not be affected by this.
Paul Mason, when he comes home, no one stops him at the border, right? Well, tell me, what kinds of things irk the government? For example, I've noticed, and I'm not knowledgeable in the role of intelligence services. So I've noticed that you have made it a habit of saying, and by the way, Alicia Kearns, I think she's an MI6 agent. And by the way, our former ambassador in Skopje, when you look at what he's done, there are a lot of things that make me believe that he has been a lifetime MI6 operative. Are these the kinds of things that upset people?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that Britain has, and this is little known outside the country, has probably the most pervasive and draconian system of state secrecy in perhaps the world. I mean, certainly in the Western world. And there are, for a very long time, the government has had a very effective direct and indirect means of censoring and dictating what does and doesn't get reported on. So there is a very little known Ministry of Defence body known as the DSMA Committee. This is the Defence and Security Media Advisory Committee. It is quintessentially British, which is to say gentlemanly and dishonest. So it's run out of the Ministry of Defence and is staffed by military and intelligence veterans, but it claims to be independent of government. And what it convenes regular meetings between major editors of major newspapers, members of press associations, and it arranges tours for them around the offices of MI6 and GCHQ to create this kind of chummy, crony type relationship between mainstream journalists and the security and intelligence services. What it also does as well is it routinely issues what are known as D notices, which effectively means do not publish notices. So if they feel a story is about to break, which contains information they don't want in the public domain, they write to journalists and editors and say, would you please be a good sport and not mention this person's name or this bit of information?
And are they good sport?
And invariably, it doesn't get reported on. It is voluntary, quote unquote, but behind that, people know that there will be consequences if they don't.
You know, this heavily censored media, this is not the image we have of the United Kingdom. Even the Serbs who are not too fond of the way the UK has handled. What's your professional and personal background? I mean, how did you turn out the way you did? Because most of your colleagues do not have to go through this kind of treatment.
No, well, I mean, I think if you have any understanding of how the British private school system and the elite university system works, it is a very effective means of churning out unquestioning, servile, fascist bullies, effectively, who then, yes, they are taught to crave power, to fear power, to love power. And then these people invariably end up in positions of power, and their perspectives, therefore, then shape the world around them. Pretty much the entirety of the British media is comprised of people who went to elite British private schools together. The intelligence services, likewise. The military, likewise. Government, likewise. It's a very specific club which the average person is completely shut out of. And so knowing how the system operates and knowing how utterly toxic and corrosive it is, it does give you a desire and a drive and the kind of practical framework to challenge it, which they really don't like.
So how did Belgrade become your safe haven?
Well, I had been living in London for 30 years, which is longer than anyone should live in that city. I'm a very rare example of someone who was actually born there and lived there. It's very transient and made up of people from the home counties these days. But in effect, I began travelling to Eastern Europe regularly, largely because it was cheap, and which London certainly isn't. I very much kind of identified with the people, hearts of gold, hard as nails. And I also, when I came to Serbia, it was a real kind of through the looking glass experience for me, because I'm old enough to remember the criminal destruction of Yugoslavia and all of the relentless media tub thumping for NATO to kill Serbs, and the relentless demonization of Serbia and its people as a nation of genocidal, barbaric savages. And I was actually confronted with the kindest, most courteous and welcoming people I'd ever met. And I realized that an enormous number of things that I believed about the world were completely untrue. It was quite liberating, actually. And I might add that this propaganda runs very deep. I have friends in the UK who are scared to visit me here. I had two friends of mine visited me recently. When they told people they were visiting Serbia, they were warned not to go. They were told they were extremely nervous about coming, and they themselves had a lot of their pre-existing perceptions challenged. So yeah, and I think that what was interesting as well was when I got stopped in the UK, there was an enormous amount of sympathy for me, but also there was a large number of mainstream British pundits who...
What did the National Union of Journalists do?
Oh, right. Well, they issued a statement in my defence and then promptly deleted it after...
Off the site?
Yes, after intensive public pressure to do so. And it's like, as I say, there were a large number of mainstream kind of narrative managers who were justifying what happened to me, were denying that I was a journalist and suggesting that I was something else, something rather darker, and effectively, yes, painting me as a likely criminal and traitor to my country. The reaction in Serbia was like pretty much universal outrage. The press associations here were absolutely furious. Political parties were issued statements in solidarity with me.
What's global Britain? From reading declassified files, from reading things that people drop off to the Greyzone. Sorry, what is it that's not on the surface?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, Global Britain formally is an effort to promote economic and political relations with Britain across the region, while also assisting the components of the former Yugoslavia into EU and NATO membership. The UK obviously having itself left the EU rather contradictorily. But yes, beneath the surface, it's very, very clear from the leaked files that we've received at the Grayzone that its true purpose is considerably more sinister, and it is about filling governments, security services, militaries with hand-picked, hand-groomed British assets. It's about opening up into economic markets for British penetration and domination. If politicians stand in the way of Britain, then they are to be neutralised, and Britain has a number of mechanisms for doing this. One of the key methods is by, quote unquote, promoting independent media. We're about to publish a story on Balkan Insight, that well-known CIA propaganda platform, where there is the lack of self-awareness in the leaked documents is quite remarkable. It talks about how there is a need for Britain to counter, quote unquote, state capture of the media in the Balkans. Apparently, it's okay for it to be captured by Britain, but not by national governments. And so, and then the explicit purpose is to, quote unquote, hold individuals and organizations and governments that Britain doesn't like to account.
To account.
Yes.
Alicia Kearns is still, right, until the election, the head of the Foreign
Affairs Committee.
Foreign Affairs Committee, yes.
Yeah.
You implied that she was trying to mount, I've forgotten the exact phrase, because it...
Foment war.
Well, foment war to get Britain to actually do something here. That would be quite malevolent. Now, is she for real? I mean, can you explain the phenomenon of Alicia Kearns?
Yes. Well, I think.
And is she worth? Is her name worth remembering? Is she going to disappear in this election when the Conservatives lose power, or is she going to stay interested? What's your sense of her interest in the region?
It's important to understand that the British, the proxy war in Ukraine is a product of British intelligence. It was something that they actively wanted and were pushing for. There is an organization called the Institute for Statecraft, which 10 years ago published an essay on its website stating we need to diplomatically isolate Russia, we need to demonize Russia in Western countries. And this will create the foundations of war of the old-fashioned sort, which the West and Britain will win. Okay, so Russia was drawn into intervening in Ukraine due to the attacks on its Russian-speaking population, which at the forefront of this was the same people who 10 years ago were advocating for war with Russia. To say the least, it's not gone very well. From the West's perspective, Britain has tried to escalate this as much as possible. They were behind the plotting for blowing up Kerch Bridge. They have desperately sought to counter US reluctance for this to become all-out war, and I think that the recent green lighting of strikes on Russia by Western countries as a result of British pressure and lobbying. And
helped torpedo those first peace negotiations.
Yeah, and they sabotaged the peace negotiations in April 2022. And I think that because it's going so badly and because of the risk of the US stepping back from this, because for all of its hubris and delusion, the US Imperial Brain Trust understands that this is an unwinnable quagmire, and actually it's not worth bankrupting themselves and demilitarizing themselves by providing all of their equipment and ammunition to Ukraine, because Russia's not going to back down. So in that context, Britain is desperate because its relevance internationally is entirely contingent on the US. And so it is very, very, there are elements within British intelligence who are desperate to open a second front in the proxy war. The Balkans...
And that would be in the Balkans?
Yes, and the Balkans would be, well, it's not really a world war without the Balkans, is it? But this would be an absolutely ideal theatre to draw the US into. Now, you've got to bear in mind that the British have been stirring up trouble in Bosnia, and in response to the tension that this has caused, Britain has sent tens of thousands of quote-unquote peacekeepers into Bosnia due to the alleged threat of Russian aggression, yet it is Britain who has invaded the country. In Kosovo, there are scores of British, again, quote-unquote peacekeepers dotted around the province. We are one stray trigger pull away from all-out war. Now, if you want to expand the proxy war and keep the US in, what might you do? And that seemed to be very much what Alicia Kearns was doing. It's always important to bear in mind that the intelligence services are effectively a law and government unto themselves, and they frequently act in ways that are contrary to the formal political structures. So, yes. For instance, during the 1990s, during the wars in the former Yugoslavia, Britain was adamantly opposed to intervention to the extent that they were in bitter conflict with the Clinton White House. Meanwhile, MI6 was causing, and the SAS, it seems, were causing absolute havoc in Bosnia. And Croatia too. Throughout 1991, George Bush Sr. was desperately trying to keep the Soviet Union complete and stop its breakup and assist its reimagining as the Commonwealth of Independent States, and flew to Kiev to give a speech about how, Ukraine and Russia are, as one, they are one nation and people. And meanwhile, the CIA and NED were doing everything in their power to break up the Soviet Union. The deep state frequently acts contrary to the wishes and wills of the open state.
How are we to distinguish between, like in the United States, you can pretty much see that if the New York Times gets some secret information and publishes it, and if the White House doesn't start screaming bloody murder and starting an investigation into who leaked the information, then you can pretty much figure out that the White House wanted the information to end up in the New York Times, right?
Yes.
But what do we do in the UK?
Well, it's remarkable, like how rarely the agencies leak, and then when they do once in a blue moon, it's similarly targeted, and it's a way of them shaping what is and isn't in the public domain. And for instance, this has been rather forgotten now, but I believe it was last year, the Times newspaper published, based on leaks, records of how MI6 was running an ISIS asset who ended up killing members of his own family and was quite clearly an unhinged individual, but they kept running him and giving him money and direction. That was no doubt leaked to get rid of whoever allowed this to happen for, internal reasons. Maybe someone was after their job. I think we should always, when things get published that appear to be based on insider sources or insider information, which we have to understand, well, they want this in the public domain, and the reason isn't the actual thrust of the article. So to give you an example, the New York Times recently published, revealed in an exclusive expose how British and American intelligence officials were active in Tel Aviv, assisting the Israelis in hostage rescue and tracking down Hamas, because they're doing this out of the goodness of their hearts, of course, because they want the war to stop and they want the killing to stop. So that's why they are complicit directly in the Gaza genocide, is because they want less people to die. And my surmise is the reason that this was published is it's about normalizing direct British and American involvement in the war, particularly as Israel gears up for conflict with Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is a war that they cannot win. And they've already lost, in effect. So they're obviously going to need British and American soldiers on the ground. And this is laying the foundations for that.
Well, I found that it's dangerous and somehow very bad to amplify correct information. You can get slapped with different punishments if you have amplified something, and it's like another way of saying, don't you dare quote this.
Yeah.
But now they don't say, don't you dare quote this, they say, don't you dare amplify.
Yeah. Well, it's quite remarkable. I published for my website, which is KITKLARENBERG.com, imaginatively. I published an investigation into how the CIA and MI6 created ISIS, and this was based on publicly available information, declassified documents, etc. Almost immediately, this caused a bit of a sensation when I dropped it, and almost immediately people started reporting to me that they'd been banned from Facebook for sharing it, because it was produced by a quote-unquote dangerous individual. This is a designation that Facebook usually applies to people who've been involved in mass shootings and other horrific incidents like that, but they applied it to me for the crime of investigative journalism. A friend of mine who runs a very popular independent news site, Council of State Media, he shared it on his page, which had, I think it was 50,000 likes. He was banned He was forced to remove the content, and he was told that Facebook would from now on would forever algorithmically deboost him to prevent anyone seeing his posts organically. So therefore, just destroying his page outright. Yeah, I mean, that's quite frightening. But I was going to get onto the second source of optimism, is that repressive power structures reach their most repressive when they're on the verge of collapse. And it's like when you can't control people with brainwashing and propaganda and implied like social control, then you reach for the truncheon. But this is almost invariably when they are on the verge of total collapse. I mean, in the UK, you can't fool people anymore. They realise they're living in a sick, collapsing society. 90% of people are dissatisfied in work. 12% of people believe that mainstream political parties represent the public's views. These are statistics which point to a looming revolution.